Well, I thank the Dean immensely for so generous an introduction, and I couldn't help but notice the ridicule and incredulity that flowed through the room at the reference to honorary degrees. So let me begin by explaining just how bogus I really am. I attended 4 post-secondary institutions of celebrated learning, 2 of them law schools, as a matter of fact, and over an infinite number of years managed never but ever to acquire a degree. I do not recommend that to people in this room, but that was my fate, and I have therefore spent my entire adult life desperately, shamelessly hankering for honorary degrees in order to achieve through the back door what was denied me through the front. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm particularly delighted because I have reached a point in my geriatric state of resisting formal speeches as much as possible and enjoy this kind of interaction. And I want to set out a few things as a prelude, and then perhaps we can chat about international legal advocacy. I am by no means a scholar or intensely knowledgeable about the subject matter, but I'll do the best I can. And I think if I am creating a context which may have some legitimacy, let me put it this way. When I left the role of envoy on HIV/AIDS in Africa at the end of 2006, along with a very close colleague, a woman in Boston, Paula Donovan is her name, we decided together, having worked over the previous many years on HIV/AIDS related issues, we decided we wanted to continue, but we wanted to focus exclusively and single-mindedly on advocacy. Not a programmatic organization, not a service organization, but an organization that would engage in some of the most difficult, contentious issues around the pandemic and indeed around many other areas as well. And we would take on everything and be as uncompromising and principled as possible, in the process undoubtedly alienating many members of the international establishment. We are experts in alienation. We alienate almost everyone we deal with. I'm very pleased about that, and it is one of the rationales on the basis of which we work. The first thing we did, and this is not legal, but it does give you a sense and a flavor of the organization of AIDS-Free World, which is what we called our advocacy group. The first thing we did was to fight determinedly for the establishment of a new international agency for women. We are an avowedly feminist organization. Everything we do is measured against gender equality, and particularly against a feminist analysis. So we knew, and Paula had written a searing monograph called Gender Equality Now or Never, we knew that one of the greatest failings of the international multilateral system was an absence of focus on gender, and that the UN's record was particularly abysmal. So against all odds, and a great deal of cynicism and a dismissive contempt, we sought to get the world to embrace an international agency for women. And as it happens, Kofi Annan appointed a particular high-level group to examine the socioeconomic side of the United Nations. We lobbied that group ferociously. We then lobbied the international community through the ambassadors to the United Nations. And lo and behold, against everyone's assumption, the agency was created anew in 2011. And the first Undersecretary General was Michelle Bachelet, the former president of Chile. She recently left that post, went back to run for the presidency again, I think this month or next. And there is a new successor who is a quite formidable cabinet minister taken from South Africa who is assuming the post. But it made us feel that if you engage in advocacy, and this is why I wanted to open with it, if you engage in advocacy which is absolutely indefatigable and tenacious, that you're neither intimidated nor stopped by the powers that be, you can ultimately break through if the cause has legitimacy. And having the International Agency for Women come about was very exciting. We obviously never did it alone. There were gradually consortia of activist women's groups around the world who joined in the pressure on governments to implement, but no one thought it would happen. And it now has between $200 and $300 million a year, which is pathetic compared to the $3 to $4 billion a year of an outfit like UNICEF, shows where the world's interests lie when it comes to women. But nonetheless, it's in place, and it's building, and it's getting more money, and it will make a difference. The next two areas which consumed us as AIDS-Free World, we are, by the way, a group of 12 people working virtually. We have people in San Francisco, Boston, New York, Toronto, Jamaica, Europe, and Africa. The next two issues which completely preoccupied us were, number one, sexual violence, and number two, LGBT imperatives. We moved on sexual violence in part because of the obvious relationship to HIV. The extent of and brutality of sexual violence allows for the transmission of the virus in the course of the raping. But also because back in 2008, and if some of you have read the website, you will know this, back in 2008, we were approached by a group in Zimbabwe to help them because during the election campaign, Mugabe, who is a certifiable lunatic as well as president of Zimbabwe, Mugabe had unleashed his youth corps and his war veterans to rape women solely and exclusively because they supported the opposition party. And it was a nightmare. It was absolutely beyond the capacity of the mind to absorb. And instead of doing the usual anecdotal stuff, which would have been fairly easy, Paula said, why don't we take affidavits? Why don't we see if we can assemble a case and somehow get it before the courts and get these perpetrators before the courts and reduce the culture of impunity? So we did. We went through a very scary and difficult process of secreting the women out of Zimbabwe. We took affidavits in Botswana and South Africa. We did it in concert with a very, very large law firm in the United States, DLA Piper, one of the biggest in the world, who gave us all of their support pro bono, over $1 million worth of support. They made 6 successive trips to Africa. We assembled affidavits in excess of, well, somewhere between 70 and 100 affidavits. We could have taken many more, but they were ultimately representative of every province and region in Zimbabwe. And we assembled a dossier which we believed showed unassailably crimes against humanity. And we wanted, of course, to find a way to use the judicial system. Then we were stymied. I mean, it's really rather interesting. Obviously, there was no recourse to justice in Zimbabwe itself. All the judges are in the pockets of the government, and they did not ratify the International Criminal Court statute. The only way we could do it was to use the principle of universal jurisdiction, which was embraced by South Africa. They have domesticated the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court statute. And everybody again said, not a chance, they'd never do it. The National Prosecuting Authority, the South African Police Service, they won't want to touch you. But after 4 years of being stymied, primarily because the government of South Africa was standing in the way, we finally put the dossier. I mean, it's you want to do it because the sexual violence is so extreme and because the women feel their lives have been destroyed and all they want is justice. So we were determined to get them justice one day. And we finally submitted the dossier last December to the National Prosecuting Authority, and to everyone's surprise, in February, they said they would launch an investigation. And the nature of the investigation, the extent of the investigation is not yet clear, but at least it's underway. There is an analogous case on torture in Zimbabwe proceeding through the courts. We've been accepted as amicus on the Supreme Court hearing, which is, if memory serves me, November the 1st. We have wonderful South African lawyers. All our lawyers are women. I'm very tickled by that. And I believe that we've made a breakthrough of some considerable proportion in the use of universal jurisdiction. Again, it's fragile, but we are single-minded in our determination to continue pursuing it. Then, and subsequent to that, we've done work in the Congo, work in Kenya, work in Liberia, chronicling the patterns of sexual violence. And now AIDS-Free World, again, Paula Donovan, my co-director, who's a brilliant analytic feminist mind. Paula has fashioned an approach to the prevention of sexual violence, which I think is nowhere else being tried now. We're going to do it in 10 countries in 20 sites. It's enormously ambitious for a small group. But all the money that's going to sexual violence at the moment is going to healing the women after the rapes have occurred. There's almost no focus on prevention, and that's what we hope to shift the balance on. Now, then in the second area, and then I'll stop and we can exchange views. The MAC AIDS Foundation, MAC, the cosmetics firm, they have one lipstick which they sell, and it brings in a huge income, particularly when Lady Gaga started to endorse it. And they now bring in $40 to $50 million a year through the sale of one lipstick, and they devote all of that money to causes involving HIV and AIDS. So they got in touch with us about 3 to 4 years ago and said, would we go into the Caribbean, specifically Jamaica, and try to do something about the homophobia. I've never been in a country as homophobic as Jamaica. It's absolutely staggering. We did a serious survey in Jamaica in concert with the University of the West Indies, which showed that something close to 90% of those who were surveyed self-identified as homophobic. And 86% did not want the laws changed, that is, the criminalization of homosexuality. They wanted, called the sodomy laws. They didn't want any of those laws changed. We decided on a particular strategic approach. We decided that at first we should try to soften up the culture and get the debate churning about the human rights of LGBT groups. And then we would try some legal interventions to see if we could make progress. So for the first couple of years, we focused on letters to the editor, op-eds, public service announcements, public debates, demonstrations. We made the struggle for gay rights a kind of co-celeb within Jamaican society. And then we started, in the Caribbean generally, a series of legal interventions, of which we now have 5 occurring simultaneously. The first was to go before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which has no legal authority as such, but it hears submissions and it makes judgments, and although they're not binding, they have tremendous influence on the laws of the various countries. We went before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, challenging the sodomy laws of Jamaica. We then took on all 3 major television networks for refusing to play our public service announcement, which was a 30-second video on tolerance. It was so tame, it's almost embarrassing. But they wouldn't touch it because the tolerance implied that we were supporting gay rights. So we took them to court, and we fought it out in court, and the judgment is not yet rendered. It'll probably be rendered within the next month. We know that if we lose at the first, we're going to appeal it right down the line. We'll go to the Privy Council of the United Kingdom if we have to. But we know that along the way we'll get the right judgment. We may not get it immediately because everybody's so intimidated in Jamaica about taking positions in favor of gay rights, including, I think, if intimidation doesn't attach to the judiciary, certainly the presence of very powerful forces makes it very difficult. But we made a good argument, and I think it will ultimately prevail. Then we took on the governments of Trinidad and Belize, and that's now in process, on their immigration law. Both countries have immigration laws which bar the entry to homosexuals, if you can believe it. By the way, the same immigration laws also bar the entry to people with disabilities. It's absolutely unbelievable. And the descriptions of both gay persons and disabled persons are so primitive and medieval it takes your breath away. So we've challenged the homosexual side of the law. We're going to come back to the disabled side of the law. And that is now going before the Caribbean Court of Justice, which is the primary court of the Caribbean, and we'll see where that leads. But that's also in process this fall. Finally, we decided to make a domestic challenge to the Jamaican sodomy laws. There is in Jamaica something called, you may be familiar with it in your legal studies, a savings law clause. And the savings law effectively says that there are certain things in the Constitution you cannot challenge. And those things are anything to do with homosexuality, anything to do with abortion, and anything to do with pornographic materials. And the savings law clause saves those areas from adjudication. So the argument is that you can't even raise the question of challenging the anti-homosexuality law in Jamaica because it is saved from any public suit. We brought together a number of really good lawyers. We have a wonderful lawyer out of Jamaica ourselves, a fellow named Maurice Tomlinson, and we just hired a brilliant young woman, Anika Gray, who must be only 25 or 26 years old, but she just graduated from law school. She's doing such good research, it takes your breath away. And we had Maurice and Anika take a look at whether or not there was any way to mount a domestic challenge. And we felt that there was. We felt that the new Constitution of Jamaica gives to the right to privacy a capacity to trump the savings law clause. And we're intervening on that basis. There's been one case management conference already. The second case management conference is on Friday of next week. There are now 8 right-wing fundamentalist religious groups arrayed against us, as well as the government of Jamaica. I mean, this is a tough slog. But I love the legal analysis, and I think that it's very artful in the way it's been designed, and we have consulted with some Canadian law firms who think that there's a fighting chance if by chance we get a panel of activist judges. And again, if we don't win in the court of first intervention, we're taking it higher. For us, this is a battle to be won. In the process, of course, the governments are getting very anxious, and there's more exposure now to LGBT issues than there's ever been in the Caribbean. And now Maurice and his husband are conducting documentation and training sessions all over the Caribbean. In fact, for 2 weeks ending last week, they did a training session with 125 members of the police service in St. Lucia and surrounding islands. They had never dealt with LGBT issues in the context of the police before. So the law leads to other cultural interventions. And again, my own feeling is that whatever the issue, if you're indomitable and you absolutely insist on keeping at it, it's worth it. It's tough to raise money for advocacy. People want to know exactly what they're going to get for their contributions. So they'd like to know how many orphans will you pay the school fees for, how many grandmothers will you feed, how many houses will you build. When you're doing advocacy, it's tougher to set an actual outcome which satisfies funders. So it's tough to get funding. But on the other hand, it's delicious when you can discombobulate a government. I really love that. I mean, I spent much of my life sitting in the Ontario legislature opposite pre-Paleolithic Neanderthals who called themselves conservatives, and my own political life was an exercise in almost transcendental futility. So I have a lot of rage stored up and ready to be disgorged at a moment's notice. But I do believe that you can make progress, and in the process, one of the things that it opens up is the possibility of using international law to challenge UN agencies, to challenge multinational corporations, to take on some of the conventions. When a country ratifies a convention on the rights of the child and children's rights are trampled, can you go after UNICEF, which has a requirement, an obligation under the convention to protect children? I mean, what can you do within the rubric of the law? It's so fascinating. In any event, that's what engages me for what it's worth. And I say to all of you that it's a tremendously fascinating world out there where bright legal minds are ever more in demand as the world decides, which is increasingly true, that human rights should be the centerpiece of international activity, and frankly, global health has become a kind of preoccupation of the international community, so health and human rights comes together. That's why HIV and AIDS makes such sense as an entry point. That's all. I'm more than happy to answer questions or to attempt to engage in an exchange. And yes, by all means, right at the door. Sorry, can you grab a mic? I think it'd be easier.
Thanks, my friend was just raising his hand on my behalf.
Right.
To start off with, just to let you guys know, that's the Viva Glam 2 lipstick from MAC. So if you wanted to contribute to
you know, I couldn't remember Viva Glam. I don't use it regularly, so but thank you for remembering it.
My question was, specifically you mentioned human rights issues with disability in terms of immigration laws. But globally, there are so many crossover issues when it comes to disabilities, partially because most people with disabilities also have issues of poverty, potentially abuse. Women who have disabilities are particularly vulnerable to the types of, or even more vulnerable to the types of issues that other women face. But for a person with a disability who is very passionate about that and is in an activist position, it's obviously a lot harder to physically get to some of the places where the greatest international challenges lie. And so my question for you was, what is the best way to go about influencing international humanitarian discourse or activity without necessarily being able to travel to the places that you're concerned about?
There is ever since the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities became an instrument of international law, it was ratified, I guess that's 2006, 2007, and subsequent to the convention, the World Health Organization report of 2 to 3 years ago setting out a percentage of 15% of the world's population being disabled. Ever since those two things came together, you've had a much greater awareness and consciousness internationally of moving on issues of disability. Major organizations like Human Rights Watch and some of the UN agencies like UNICEF and UNDP have actually now built major divisions in response to international disability questions. So being in touch with them, being in contact with them without having to travel does mean a lot. Now, without overdoing it, because it's embarrassing, I think AIDS Free World is one of the very few organizations in the world that has absolutely been preoccupied on issues of disability, and we intervene everywhere. So we started back in Mexico in 2008 with the first town hall meeting on disability. We brought in people with disabilities from around the world, and we had a major town hall meeting at the International AIDS Conference itself. And then in Vienna, we went further and had a series of panels inviting more and more of the delegates and having people with disabilities playing a much more central role. And then in 2012, in July, in Washington at the International AIDS Conference, we actually took an entire day on a seminar on advocacy for people with disabilities, schooling them, tutoring in advocacy techniques, and we used the wonderful University of the Deaf in Washington. Why am I not remembering the name? Gallaudet, yes, Gallaudet, right. Gallaudet, a fantastic campus and a tremendous university. And we used Gallaudet. We brought in about 25 young people with disabilities from 20 different countries. We spent the entire day in an intensive session on the eve of the International AIDS Conference. And then those who had attended the seminar moved into the conference and started making demands in the presence of 20,000 delegates. It was both telling and moving. And we won't give that up. I mean, just as we're speaking now, we're finding a way, these young people they were in their 20s and 30s, who were part of that seminar in Washington, they are now in constant contact together on Facebook and email, and we're just negotiating, making it possible for 5 of them to attend a major seminar. And they're young people who were deaf and blind and in wheelchairs, and they were incredibly smart, and they laid out for us in ways that are really challenging and impressive the struggle in their lives. So I think that you can find individual NGOs and you can find some organizations which can take the case forward. Yes, sorry.
One second follow-up to that. I think there's actually a really nice fit with disability issues in the AIDS organization because HIV itself is an episodic disability. And so it's interesting to me to see how little overlap there has been historically, and I think that's something that's really changing, which I'm very happy to see.
You're quite right about that. And by the way, one of the activists who spoke at that Washington seminar and who's been terrific with an organization called Disabled People's International, with an organization called Handicap International, is a fellow named Steve Este. He's deaf later in life. He doesn't use sign language. He doesn't use lip reading. He uses CART, which is a pretty elaborate business of having a kind of equivalent of a court stenographer traveling with you all the time to provide on a screen a translation of what's being said. And he's actually won a nomination in the riding of Dartmouth North in Nova Scotia, the provincial elections on November the 8th. You can guess which party he was nominated for. And my impression is that he has a very, very good chance to win. And it will put someone in the legislature with huge international experience of disability. It will really mean quite something. Anyone else? Yes?
I think I'm good.
Sure.
So I was wondering, like, when you're talking about LGBT rights in different countries, the Caribbean and whatnot, just because like gay rights, at least in the modern sense, have been more tied to kind of Western nations. How do you? I think you touched on this briefly, but how do you engage in those kinds of human rights issues with like avoiding the risk of kind of modern day like imperialistic kind of interplay into like the cultures of other countries?
You know, there are some rights that are not negotiable. And we're not going to get into the nonsense of cultural relativism. What Putin is doing to gay people in Russia, what the piece of legislation that's on the books in Uganda, what's happening almost everywhere else in the countries of Africa, this is simply and absolutely unacceptable. And we're not prepared to negotiate about it. And you know, it's like working on the Zimbabwe case. People said to us, how dare you attempt to force something in South Africa? Who the hell are you? You're an organization outside. Our position is these are crimes against humanity. They don't know borders. These are things which people who believe in human rights stand up for. So on LGBT rights, we are sensitive, of course. You know, you're not determinedly provocative if you want to win over some change, but we're not willing to play with it. And you know, that was what was so interesting. The Dean made reference to the Commission on HIV and the Law. There were 15 of us as commissioners. We met for 18 months. Some of the commissioners were pretty damned impressive. There are a couple of former presidents and a number of major judges. Edwin Cameron of South Africa, a tremendously well-known judge, Michael Kirby of Australia, and a number of feminists from Africa and beyond. It was an exhilarating commission. I've sat on commissions. This is the first one I really enjoyed. And our report is essentially on what happens to using the law to prejudice the rights of men who have sex with men, sex workers, injecting drug users, prison populations, women, children, access to medicines, and overall the criminalization of HIV and what all of that means. We met all over the world with regional groups who made submissions. They all said the same thing. You know, I mean, you're right, there is this cultural dimension, but they all said we're being brutalized by fascist governments. It's not the word they used easily, but that's what they meant. And we want to do something about it. Will you help us? This is slightly out of school. Can you, well, I don't think I'll be in trouble saying this. Yesterday afternoon, Richard Elliott, who is the executive director of something called the HIV/AIDS Legal Network in Canada, he's a lawyer, tremendously bright and articulate fellow. I love him dearly. He's amazing. And we met, the two of us, with Premier Kathleen Wynne of Ontario and her judicial advisor, so just four of us, and we talked for an hour about the criminalization of HIV and the kinds of cases prosecutors were bringing against people with HIV. So there was a recent case in Barrie in Ontario where a woman who had engaged in oral sex was charged with aggravated sexual assault because she was HIV positive and there was non-disclosure, when in fact you know from all the scientific evidence that the transmission of oral sex is infinitesimal, is not to be counted. And what do you do if you have evidence that there's been condom use, or that somebody's on antiretrovirals, so that the viral load in the body is reduced to undetectable levels, and therefore when you engage in unprotected sex you don't pass the virus? So there are so many reasons for not being punitive in the prosecution of those who are HIV positive. And interestingly enough, in the world, it's North America that is most brutal towards people who are found, who are charged with crimes under the criminal code for non-disclosure, and it's so unmerited, it's so revolting. But it was great to have a conversation with such an intelligent person. I mean, she's a liberal, for heaven's sake. She has that terrible ideological deficit, but nonetheless, it was a tremendous pleasure, because she's really very smart and fully understands the issues and is very sympathetic. And that's a kind of legal advocacy, because we were talking about the charges that are being laid. And we were taking issue with the Supreme Court of Canada and their decision in a couple of recent cases. Anyone else? Yes.
I was just wondering, it's kind of a two-part question. When you're speaking to people, whether you're presenting or arguing this and that, I was curious as to whether you have found, regarding issues that are traditionally framed as women's issues, your gender as a male has been to your detriment, or whether it's been advantageous as far as people actually listening to what you're saying. I realize that you might not be able to separate the fact that your gender from the fact that you are obviously extremely accomplished and well-spoken, all these other things. And then if you have found it to be advantageous, or even if you haven't, I guess, what you would suggest that we can be doing in general to engage more men in issues of sexual violence and this and that, which are treated as women's issues, where they're really everyone's issues.
I haven't felt any deficit in personal terms. I've had a number of occasions when women have approached me and said it's great to have a man speaking in this way on these issues. I have a tremendous advantage. I've had 50 years of marriage to a feminist, an outspoken, uncompromising feminist who shaped my views. I was, I think, probably when I got married in 1963, I was a really, an unpleasant jock who reflected all the most objectionable behavior of young male jerks. And Michelle, who has often taken a public platform herself, because she was for 25 years the leading feminist columnist in the Toronto Star. Michelle, on public platforms, has often said that it took her 20 years to turn me into a human being, but she persevered, and now it's not too bad. But I really think for me that's been the entire. I mean, I could not have functioned international. I'm a democratic socialist. The socialism I inherited was sexist. I mean, left-wingers have often had difficulty with gender equality, just one of the realities. It's better now than it used to be, but it's still not there. And Michelle brought for me a sense of a feminist analysis and a feminism which changed everything, and it means that my contemporary life is spent in the presence of and in concert with feminist activists. So I've never had any trouble as a man in stating these things. But in terms of your second question, you're completely right, of course. You've got to get men involved. I'm going to give you a personal dilemma, if I may. Don't judge me too harshly. I'm 75, I'm in my dotage. I don't know how many years I have left. And the women are being brutalized now. And I know it's going to take 1 or 2 generations at best to change male sexual behavior. It's a long, hard road. And I want to work as vigorously as possible with the women who are fighting back, changing the cultural impressions, showing tremendous resilience in the face of horrors, and really altering the landscape. And although what happened last December in India was just the most terrifying and awful tragedy, the extraordinary emergence of women's activism in India in the aftermath is something to behold. Now, the judge who just found these 4 men guilty and meted out capital punishment, that doesn't overcome the fact that there are roughly 70 to 80,000 cases waiting, and the conviction rate is roughly 4%, and it takes 8 or 9 years to get a case before the courts. And this judge who prescribed the death penalty had done 32 previous rape cases and acquitted every single alleged assailant. So it's a difficult combination, and there are some tremendous groups who are working on male involvement in changing the paradigm. It's not a word I like, changing the dynamic. But it's going to take a very long time. Just for your interest, there's a group called Sonke Gender Justice. It's SONKE in South Africa. I can't remember whether it's in Cape Town or Johannesburg. They do some remarkably good stuff with men in South Africa, which has levels of sexual violence that are hallucinatory. They're a nightmare. But there are good groups like that, and there are people like Eve Ensler with V-Day. Eve, we work very closely with Eve, and she too is more and more beginning to bring men into the equation. But for me, right now, my concentration is on what's happening to the women at this moment, because it's just the contagion. I mean, Steubenville, the American military, the chant at St. Mary's College in Canada, or I gathered something happened at UBC, even this pristine organization. But just everywhere you turn, it's just so awful. Whether it's rape and conflict, politically orchestrated rape, gang rape, intimate partner rape, it's just marital rape, the country after country. They did this study in Asia of 10,000 men and found that 1 out of every 10 admitted to raping more than one woman, and 1 out of every 4 said that they had raped within an intimate partner relationship. And in 6 of the 8 countries surveyed, there are no laws against marital rape. I mean, there's so much to be done on those fronts. There's a good advocacy legal vehicle if you want one. I'd love to see an international campaign on laws against marital rape, because we've got a campaign against child marriage internationally now being pursued. But what about this phenomenon of marital rape? In Kenya, when the Sexual Offences Bill came before the Parliament, there was a clause prohibiting rape in marriage. And the clause came out because every woman stood and said, this should stay in, and all the male legislators say, there's no such thing as rape in marriage. This is ridiculous. It's all consensual. And they took the clause out. What did they leave in? They left in a clause, and you're going to find this hard to believe, they left in a clause which says that if a woman brings a charge of rape, and the man against whom the charge is laid is acquitted, then the 10-year sentence which he would have served had he been convicted is served by the woman who made the allegation. So this is a long battle, and that's why I'm on that side of it at this moment. But you make a very good point. Anyone else? Yes?
I wanted to ask if you have, for those of us looking to enter, if you can call it the profession of legal those of us looking to participate in legal advocacy, and I don't know if anyone would agree with me on this, but I find that we are often told it's very hard, there's lots of competition, and not to mention overlapping nonprofit avenues that sometimes actually end up having little fights amongst themselves and not dealing with the actual issues they've all been created to combat. What would your advice be to people surveying this landscape and looking to traverse it?
Well, I'm making the assumption, an uninformed assumption, that there's probably a legal clinic which the young lawyers-to-be, the students, are engaged in legal clinics. So almost every law school now has a legal clinic which deals in human rights issues, or I assume in a place like British Columbia there would be dealings in Aboriginal issues and around the question of human rights. I was at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission meetings last week in Vancouver, and I mean, I've heard it all, from testimony from the women who were raped in the Rwandan genocide through to HIV and AIDS, and I must say some of the things I heard at that Truth and Reconciliation Commission testimony, I just couldn't get over. I just could not believe that in my country these things had happened and clearly had the sanctity of government and the church. It was absolutely astounding. It was so depraved, so demented, and so determined to expunge an entire culture from Canadian society that I mean, I'm not naive, but when you hear women in their 50s and 60s taking the platform and saying, I was a little girl of 5 years old, I was taken to a residential school, and I was raped the first day, and I was raped every day thereafter. Or a young man looking out at the audience and saying, I was 11 years old when he pulled my pants down. And one woman looking at us and saying, I don't want an apology from government. I want an apology from Sister Ruth Ann, who beat me every day for 6 years. I mean, you really have to wonder the horror, depravity that was visited. So there's tremendous room for advocacy, legal advocacy, and I think there's a lot of public interest advocacy which is coming to the fore, and more and more law firms have pro bono groups in the law firm. There's a law firm I've spoken to in Vancouver, and I'm going back to see them in October, who have 6 of their leading lawyers who do almost all public interest advocacy work. It's a fairly major firm in Vancouver. And I've now understood that all the firms have it, and there are a lot of excellent places for lawyers to pursue because of the training. Our older daughter, who runs my foundation, was a human rights lawyer. But spent very little time in the practice of law, but a lot of time in pursuing issues which are fundamentally legal, even if not pursued in legal ways. So I think the hope is pretty good. I think that there's a possibility out there. You've got to be stoic. You've got to knock on doors. You've got to pursue it relentlessly. But it's not too bad. I teach a class on the Millennium Development Goals at Ryerson, and the class is overwhelmingly women, and it's large, and so many of them are looking for humanitarian or human rights work when they leave. They don't have any legal professional background. Most of them go on to do MAs, but then they want a job. And I'm fascinated, and they're constantly in touch, and I'm fascinated by how many of them find a place. I mean, they just keep at it. And one ends up in Afghanistan, and one ends up in Malawi, and one ends up in Mali, and they work for Médecins Sans Frontières, and they work for CARE or Save the Children, and they never give up, and something opens up, even in the UN. So don't give up on those things. It's really a matter of tenacity more than anything else. And drop me a note, and without any evidence, I'll endorse you. Anything from anyone else? I'm not offended if I've... yes, Flora.
The media has been having a field day recently with the idea that Kenya might go against its commitment to the International Criminal Court, and there's all this discussion about the ICC being sort of a Western construct, and a lot of African countries contemplating signing the Rome Statute. And I'm just wondering what your perspectives are on what the future of the administration of justice will look like, whether it will be ad hoc tribunals, whether there will be a version of truth commissions, if you think there will be a disintegration of the ICC because it's sort of pitting this idea of West versus Africa. How do you see that unfolding?
I think it'll be very sad if Kenya does withdraw from the International Criminal Court, but of course they have voted in Parliament to do so. And now that the President and the Deputy President are charged with crimes against humanity and are appearing before the International Criminal Court, it raises a very real question. I don't think that will ever be resolved. They're not going to give up the presidency and the deputy presidency. But the court refuses to delay the hearings. They're going on. The president will be heard allegedly starting November 21st. The deputy president's hearing is now. This terrible terrorist attack in Nairobi may set things back somewhat because there's a great deal of obvious sympathy for Kenya in light of what's happened. You know, I don't think they've targeted Africa, but I think they make a reasonable argument. I mean, that's my own personal opinion. There's absolutely no question that George Bush and Tony Blair should be charged with crimes against humanity. What they did in Iraq is absolutely and totally indefensible. It's as bad in every way as what al-Bashir did in Sudan. But no one will touch a former president or a former prime minister, even though there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people dead and an entire society virtually destroyed because they were pursuing their own political ends. And so Africa quite honestly and thoughtfully says to itself, how come it's al-Bashir? How come it's the heads of Kenya? How come there are others who are on the list? Why are they always African? Well, they aren't always African, but that's what it's been so far. I think we're going to see a number of independent commissions, like the International Criminal Court spin-off that dealt with Rwanda, like the International Criminal Court spin-off that's dealing with Cambodia, like the special court that's been set up for Sierra Leone. I think these are very interesting experiments in justice that will probably work. I'm not a person who, this was what made last weekend for me very difficult. I'm not really a person who believes in the truth and reconciliation process. This is dreadful. I'm a real fundamentalist hardliner. You shouldn't have to put up with me. This business of reconciliation, that really gets to me. I never understood how Bishop Tutu did it in South Africa. Perpetrators come forward, and they said, we tortured you, we killed your children, we engaged in atrocities, and we're sorry. And that's it. That's the, at a tribunal on African grandmothers a couple of weeks ago, Gloria Steinem was present, and we were discussing truth and reconciliation, and she was saying she's not big on reconciliation either, and she says, have you thought of calling it truth and retribution? And I thought, oh, that's brilliant. I really like that, although I didn't have the courage to advance it when the opportunity arose. But I have trouble with reconciliation. I think that doesn't. It's not vengeance. It's just it's like never getting rapists on trial so that the culture of impunity continues. And if you don't deal through the judicial process when crimes have clearly been committed, and they are crimes against humanity, then something's wrong, and you're not absolved by saying, I am sorry, forgive me. That's not good enough for me. But it's good enough for a lot of other people. My position is very much, not sure it's a minority position, but it certainly isn't as yet an accepted position. Yes?
So you spoke about doing GLBT work. And I've known a lot of organizations that say that they do GLBT work, and they do work explicitly on sexual orientation, and any benefit to trans people is accidental. They do, sex workers' rights obviously benefits trans people. trans people get benefited sideways because they happen to also be members of these other groups, but not trans activism. You say you're doing GLBT activism. To what extent are you actually doing activism around trans?
We're not. And that's not, we just haven't got involved at this point. And you're right, the only benefits are side benefits. And in fact, it's often destructive to trans people when members of the LGBT community, they don't exactly turn on them, but dissociate themselves. But there's obviously, again, a kind of international awakening on trans issues, and there's more and more attention being paid. In our HIV Commission and the Law, we devoted a section to trans because we felt that it had to be seen as a serious question of legal discrimination. So I will admit that we as yet have not taken on that issue as such or a case. I wouldn't be surprised if one day we did. We're just a tiny group. We can't take on more than
And that's totally fine.
Yeah.
And no group should be everything to all people. But what's your strategy in including the T there? Is that, is the honesty in saying GLB worth more than the increase in visibility in saying GLBT? Why do you choose to take that approach?
Well, we use LGBTQI sometimes. Just one uses the entire range of the alphabet. But I think that you're quite right in raising it. We have dealt at this point with gays and lesbians, gay men and lesbians in our dealings. And we haven't really gone beyond that. But I think we use the entire panoply because we understand that all of these are related discriminations which one day we'll have to get involved in. I don't run from that. We're just proceeding slowly, but we recognize the inevitability and the relationship. Yes?
Your talk, you said something about shifting.
I'm sorry. This is not your fault. I have a hearing problem. So.
During your initial notes, you said something about shifting the focus from helping women post-rape to changing the culture to pre-rape, and I'm assuming you mean going through the judicial system and sort of bringing perpetrators of the crime, into the court and making it socially a very unacceptable thing that way. But what about in cases or in countries where the judicial system has failed? So I'm thinking specifically about Egypt now. I'm thinking about Tahrir Square and I read a very, very horrific essay on the kind of rape that's happening in Tahrir Square, and it's gang rape. But what kind of programs can be done there to change, to kind of still focus on the pre-rape culture, but not go through the judicial system?
It's so interesting. I'm so glad you raised that. I'm in your debt. It's very interesting the way in which the world has focused on rape in conflict. The major initiative which has emerged from the United Kingdom and from the Division of International Development and the Foreign Office, they've put a lot of money in, and they made a major statement under UN auspices a month or two ago, and of course Charlize Theron was on one side and Angelina Jolie was on the other. If you don't have a celebrity, you're nowhere these days. I'm a friend of Oprah Winfrey's, for any of you who want to be impressed. And they sat down and they made it clear that they were going to invest a lot of money and do a lot of work where there was incendiary rape in Egypt, in Syria, in the Congo, in Mali, and wherever there was violence or conflict, they were going to do something about it. One of the worries in that, of course, is that it assumes that the contagion of rape in so many other ways is not important. What happened in India was not in conflict. What happened in South Africa right after was not in conflict. What happened in the American military is not a conflict. These are not conflict zones. So why do you focus, even the Nobel Women's Committee, why do you focus on rape and conflict as such? Why don't you focus on the phenomenon of sexual violence wherever it occurs? That is our approach. I don't know what you do about Tahrir Square. There's a fabulous young Egyptian woman Shireen El-Feki, who has written a book on Arab sexuality, and she is now analyzing what is happening within Egypt. She is part Egyptian, part Canadian, and she's analyzing very carefully. It's a book worth reading. It's called The Citadel, Sexual Practice in the Arab States. And I think that that's a very tough question. But can I just, as we end, because I'm excited by it, can I just take 2 minutes to tell you what we're trying to do against all odds? And this is Paula's remarkable work, but I'm getting a kick of sort of holding on to the coattails. The central part of the analysis is the principle of non-reporting. Why is it that women don't report rapes? Everywhere you see news stories on countries, it says X thousands of women or X hundreds of women have reported rapes, but that's only 5% of the total number. And indeed, in places like the United Kingdom, it's considered to be 4% of the total number, and God knows elsewhere. So what is it that stops women from reporting? And if you can find out what the obstacles are to reporting and you remove the obstacles, then presumably you can get the perpetrators before the courts and reduce the culture of impunity and reduce the numbers of rapes. So on that question, we then began to look at the basis for non-reporting, and everyone assumed that, you know, there's a generalized assumption, it's because it will shame them or they'll be afraid of retaliation. Not at all. You learn when you've done some of the research that the non-reporting is site-specific. So we sent our gender and legal advisor, who was a young woman, lawyer in San Francisco, Shanali Shom is her name. Shanali went off to Liberia, where they have the only rape court on the continent because they have a woman president, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And they have a tremendous prosecutor, and they're not getting cases. Why aren't they getting cases? It wasn't a matter of shame or vengeance or anything that they were worried about. Number one, the police did not have petrol for their scooters to go into the hinterland to take the evidence. Number two, the women, when they came into court, were they to come into court, would have to stay overnight in Monrovia, and they had nowhere to stay and couldn't afford it. Number three, the cases were being heard during harvest season, and the women couldn't leave the fields to come to the court because, of course, the entire family is dependent on the harvest. So suddenly there emerged very specific reasons for non-reporting, which, when we looked at it further, became more and more explicit. We spent 2 weeks in Cape Town and the slum adjacent to it called Khayelitsha, speaking to every women's activist group, the feminist studies at Cape Town University, the rape crisis centers, the treatment action campaign, everybody, and they all had different reasons for non-reporting, but were thrilled at the proposition that someone might study the reasons for non-reporting and see whether the community couldn't remove those obstacles once they had identified them. So how do you identify the non-reporting? So we decided on the use of a piece of technology. There's something called Activism, computer-assisted self-interviewing. And a handheld device can ask questions, and you can answer the questions as a person being interviewed by pushing certain logos or pushing a color on the handheld device. And we decided to take it further because some of the things are complicated. What if your answer to the question, why don't you report, is, well, I can't trust the police. Every time I go to the police, they don't believe me, they don't take notes. That's a fairly lengthy answer. So in concert with something called Gembi Health Systems in Cape Town, which is an innovative technological undertaking, a tremendous little entrepreneurial center in Cape Town, the best on the continent, we're designing something called Akazi Plus, where we will be able to ask open-ended questions and get open-ended answers. And the women will have the questions that they can listen to in their own language, their own vernacular. It's battery-driven. It can be used in the rural areas. They can do it in private. There's none of this lengthy business of engaging in lengthy interviewing and making all of the notations, and the answers can be fed right back into a central system. Then you have a group of global health experts, women who are knowledgeable in these areas from all around the world, and you take a look at the answers that have been given, and you do some crowdsourcing with a limited group in order to find out how do you get past the obstacles. And we're not interested in interviewing only women who have been subject to sexual violence or rape. It's just we want to interview 400 people in the community in every aspect, so that what we can draw from it will make the community aware that their behavior has sustained what is happening to the women. And everywhere we go, people are tremendously excited about it. And Paula spoke yesterday in Geneva to a women's technology conference, and now she's on her way to Cape Town again as we further refine all of this. And women are tremendously interested in the use of the technology. We have a Canadian who wrote Wikinomics and Macroeconomics, and he's acting as our advisor. And it's just so fascinating to see it all put together. It's going to take a tremendous amount of work to hire the people who are necessary. By the time you've graduated, we'll be ready to hire you. Please keep it in mind. But it's fascinating to think that you may be able to identify the reasons for non-reporting, remove them, and then have very considerable numbers of legal cases before the courts. So it's slightly different from what others are doing. Everybody else is pouring the money in. You know, I got to take my seat. You've got to go off to other things. I can't tell you how much time I've spent at the little Pansy Hospital in Bukavu in the eastern region of the Congo, where a wonderful, just really lovely surgeon named Dr. Denis Mukwege, he and his colleagues spend much of their time surgically repairing the reproductive tracts of the women after they've been subject to this unbelievable violence perpetrated by the marauding militia groups. More than 500,000 women raped over the last 10 to 15 years. And they come in over and over again during the day. I've sat there and watched it. And adjacent to the Pansy Hospital, Eve Ensler and V-Day have built something called the City of Joy, 100 housing units where women can convalesce over a period of 6 months and find a trade and go back to their community and be strong. I was at the opening of the City of Joy. There were 3,000 women under a huge tent, singing, dancing. Every one of them had been brutally raped. And there was a young woman of 18 who took the microphone and looked down at the governor and all his satraps and sycophants, and she said to him, "You know why this is happening, Mr. Governor. You know that if it were happening to men, it would have ended 15 years ago." And there wasn't anybody who could disagree. But the strength of these women, it's unbelievable how courageous they are and how determined they are to set up a kind of monolithic force against the men who are doing it to them. And it's slow and it's painful and it just takes your breath away. And you watch what is happening in situations like that, and you know that you've got to find a way of dealing with prevention, because all the Security Council resolutions are going nowhere. The biggest peace force in the world, 20,000 peacekeepers, can't stop the raping of the women. 12 United Nations agencies ostensibly united to prevent sexual violence can't achieve it. So we've got to find an alternative. And we think we're onto something, because all the money is going to healing the women in the aftermath. I sense a looming presence, so I'm going to draw this to an end. Thanks, everyone.